Good morning. Good morning. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our forum hour. So great to have you. We had the triple whammy today, which was daylight savings plus weather plus mass optional. So thrilled to have anybody here today. We are welcoming back the Reverend Gary Jones, who is a longtime rector of St. Stephen's, Richmond. He was with us last week to preach, do the forum. He's doing the follow-up to that today. There's a handout that many of you have. And I'm going to turn it over to Gary after I pray. The Lord be with you. Actually, hold on. In order to help with sound so that the people who are online can hear better, if I could ask, we're directing everybody to the mic that's in the back. Since Gary is in this 43-inch box, I'm going to relay the questions to him by my computer. But if you'll still ask the question when it comes to question and answers from the mic in the back, that would be great. Thank you. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you for this beautiful, crisp morning. It's time to gather together. Quiet our hearts. Knit us into one body. Make our spirit draw near. Open our hands to one another, to our speaker this morning. Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Joshua, and good morning to everyone. It's a good bit quieter here in Richmond too. Not many people out. I'm sure church attendance everywhere is significantly diminished, but it surely is great to be able to join you this way. Last week in the forum, I focused on an ancient doctrine of the church that was obviously very important, not only to the earliest Christians, but down through the ages, and tried to give some examples of how this teaching, how this belief was incarnate in our lives through the ages. The doctrine itself is called theosis, or divinization, sometimes called, and it's this deep-seated belief, perhaps articulated most simply and directly by a bishop named Athanasius in the 4th century, that God became a human being so that human beings might become gods. Sounds very strange. I mean, particularly to Christians who are used to thinking of Christianity being about how to live a better life, a more ethical life. Sort of an instruction manual for good living in the world. But this way of thinking about what it means to be a Christian conveys that it's really about a deep-seated transformation or an awakening to who we most truly are. Now, Jesus sort of alluded to this teaching in pointing to the Psalms when some people were critical of Jesus for saying that he was God's son, or alluding to that idea. He said, well, doesn't your own scripture say in the Psalms, Psalm 82, you are gods, and each of you children of the Most High? But Jesus would make it even more explicit, for example, in the Gospel according to St. John, when he said, abide in me as I abide in you. I am the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you're nothing. I think it's just fascinating that one of the most powerful programs for the spiritual nurture of children, really young children, called Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, has as a kind of annual routine for these little ones, a kind of retreat in preparation for communion. And as a part of this retreat, the little ones go through what adults call a time of preparation for confession, a kind of review of one's life. But they don't talk about sins, these little children. Instead, they talk about blocks. That is, what's blocking the flow of Jesus's life into your life? I mean, they know well, these little children understand this idea that they are intimately connected to Christ and that Christ's life is their life, that it's indistinguishable. But they are also aware that they go through times when, as one of the branches connected to the vine, they're starting to wither, so just not feeling right about their life. And so the catechist will sometimes ask, well, what do you think it is that's blocking the flow of the divine life into your life so that you can live more fully who you are? And it's just, as a parish priest, I have over the years listened to these little children who come down to speak very privately with the priest about what they think is blocking the flow of the divine life, their true life into themselves. It's a great question for adults to ask. What's keeping us from living our true life? Why are we sometimes finding ourselves sort of withering on the vine? Well, I'll give some more examples about this idea of theosis, the divine indwelling in all human beings. It's just it comes with the business of being human. Jesus said, as you do even to the least of these, you're doing to me. I am in you, you are in me, just as I am in the Father and the Father is in me. It's a mystical but beautiful, life-affirming idea. Through the ages, on down to our day, Bishop Tutu, back in the days of apartheid, remember I gave you this example, he said, apartheid is not just a moral problem. Christianity is not just about discerning what's moral and immoral. In this case, apartheid is a problem of theology. He would even say that to treat a child of God as less than a child of God is an act of blasphemy. So if you try to get that into your mind, I'm used to thinking of blasphemy as sort of denying of an important teaching of the church or something, but he's making this incarnate. That is, blasphemy is not about just abstract doctrine and teaching and whether we affirm it or not. It's about how we are with each other as children of God. And so he said, you can be wonderfully correct as Anglicans, bowing before the cross as it comes down in procession, or genuflecting before the sacrament, or before receiving communion. But remember, the whole point of all of this is that we should leave this place of worship remembering that really the presence is in one another. We should be bowing to each other, genuflecting to each other as bearers of the divine. It's a beautiful, beautiful idea, this idea of theosis and divinization, it's also called. And it has tremendous implications, not only about how we treat each other, but how we come to understand who we are. Okay, so I focused last time on the contemplative dimensions of our relationship with God, with the kind of understanding that there is much that gets in the way of our realization of our true life in God. And I used the image Parker Palmer gave from his book, A Hidden Wholeness, the prelude. I even read most of it to you, in which he says, in the middle of the last century, farmers in the Midwest, at the first sign of a blizzard, like you've experienced, at the first sign of a whiteout, they would tie a rope from their back door to the barn so that they could still get out to the barn and feed the animals and find their way home, because they had all heard too many stories about farmers who, having performed the daily chores, were groping to find their way home and perished in their own backyard. For me, that image has become a metaphor for our reality, that we're in the backyard of our own souls. We're right there, groping to find our way back. But all sorts of things are getting in the way of our finding our way home. Oh, sure, it could be things like lust and greed and, pride, all these things that sort of obscure our vision. But it can also just be the blizzard of this digital life we're living, this constant incoming information that's just too much for us to handle all at once. And so we find it difficult to settle into that deeper, peaceful place of the soul and be united with our true life. So focusing first of all on this question of our relationship to God in our own souls. Today, I want to focus a little bit on how we are in relationship with each other, particularly in parish churches. But it has implications for how we're in relationship with everybody in our lives. But if we start with the church as a place where we're learning more deeply how to be soulfully present with one another, how churches can become, or even small groups within churches, soul welcoming communities, then we can carry that experience with us out into the world that fits and starts and begin to exercise at least some measure of the same in our day-to-day lives. Now, this sort of dual emphasis on our relationship on the one hand with God and our own souls, that contemplative dimension of the gospel, and this other contemplative dimension of how we might be in relationship with others, it's based on a belief that growth in the life of faith, growth in the spiritual life, requires a kind of balance. And this contemplative dimension on the individual level is trying to pay special attention to Jesus's admonition about prayer. He said, when you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and God who sees in secret will reward you there. Now, that is a huge statement, and it finds an interesting corollary in one of the best known words, so to speak, from the desert mothers and fathers of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, when sort of, so we say, spiritual tourists or people from the cities would come out to the deserts of Sinai, Jordan, and the like to get advice. One of the most memorable words given to people seeking ways to deepen their relationship with God was this. One of the desert mothers or fathers would say, go into your cell or your room, and your cell will teach you everything. Go into your room, and your room will teach you everything. Don't move around a lot. Don't try to do a whole bunch of new things in your life. Go, be still, and know. Now try to imagine this. This sometimes scares parish clergy, but there's no reason to be scared, Joshua. Imagine this idea that the church has nothing to give you that you do not already have yourself. The church is there in large measure to awaken you to a reality that has always been true, to remind you of something that you have always deep down known, though perhaps has not been in your regular consciousness, that God is already with you. Always has been, always will be. God does not know how to be absent from you. As St. Augustine said, I searched for you everywhere in my life, in the beautiful things of this world, in the philosophies and teachings of the greats. And all along, I now realize you were always with me. You have always been closer to me, Augustine said, than I have been to myself. Go into your room, be still, don't move, and see if you cannot awaken more to this truth that's always been true, always will be. You don't lack anything. Perhaps one of the reasons Jesus said, do not worry about your life. One who is deeply in touch with that truth, that contemplative truth. Now, I understand in your parish, you have a number of sort of prayer groups, centering prayer groups and the like, and Ledley is offering something called Contemplative Chapel. All these are ways that the parish church nurtures this maturation in the spiritual life. And I just, again, will reaffirm about St. Columba's, you all are real standard bearers in this kind of ministry. And this is not just an act of selfishness, as I tried to say last time. If what St. Paul said is really ultimately true of all of us, St. Paul said, now when I look inside myself, I don't see a person named Saul or Paul. Instead, more and more, I realize it's no longer I who live, I sort of lowercase I or something. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives within me. My true life. Paul is in touch with his true life. Well, if the whole point of these exercises is go into your room and your cell will teach you everything. If the whole point is that you would more and more incarnate Christ, well, it is the least selfish thing you can do to be engaged in this way of awakening to the truth of Christ, your true life, so that you can manifest Christ more in the world, in this life of love, forgiveness, mercy, service, justice, all the attributes we know of Christ through the Gospels manifest in us. So that part is important, that individual part. Also, coming to church is important, not just because of the sacraments, and not only because of this individual awakening, but so that we as individuals can recognize a truth about ourselves that St. Paul talked about in another place in his epistles. He says, we are all members of one body. Now, This would apply not just on a parish church level or an Episcopal or even a Christian level, but in a global sense. We are all one body. We are all much more connected to each other. We belong to each other in ways that we too infrequently evince in our daily lives. What we are coming to an awareness of by coming to church is we start to awaken to this reality that although I am a hand, I need that person over there who's a foot, or although I'm a nose, I need the eyes, the ears, whatever. You know, where would the body be if it was all just a hand? You know, we need each other in order to function well as human beings. So there's this big gathering of the church helping us to understand our place in the body. There's this going into your room and learning how to be more in touch with your true life in Christ. But all human beings also need an intimate sense of community, a small group. It could be just 2 or 3 people who know you extremely well, and you know them well, and you love each other. Knowing everything, you love each other. You're manifesting the gospel in this community in extraordinary ways. And so a church can be a place too, which is encouraging this kind of spiritual intimacy in a small group setting. And that's what I want to focus on now. Now, again, I'm going to come back to Parker Palmer, this Quaker writer, who in that same book, A Hidden Wholeness, uses another metaphor that I find very helpful in thinking about the soul and how we are in relationship with each other, how we might become soul welcoming people, not only of our own souls, but of one another's. And this is a huge task. We are not used to being with each other this way. Parker Palmer says the soul is inherently shy. The soul, he says, is like a wild animal. Like, I imagine a deer. And you know about deer, right? If you're in a clearing and you hope to see a deer come into the clearing, you must be very still and calm. The wild animal, the deer, the soul, is not going to emerge from the woods unless it believes deeply that it's safe. So being still, being this sort of non-judgmental, welcoming sort of presence is the way to welcoming one's own soul into one's life, uniting one's soul with one's role in life. But more importantly, what I'm focusing on today is welcoming one another's souls. Now, as I said last time I was with you, I've been Episcopalian all my life, and I know many of you have too. But whether that's true or you're sort of new to the Episcopal Church, one thing you probably get in touch with hanging out with Episcopalians is they love to do theology. You know, they love discussion groups, study groups. They kind of want to dig deeper and all this. And Parker Palmer, I think he's almost writing about Episcopalians when he says that all too often we Christians resemble people who go crashing through the woods as opposed to being still, non-judgmental, welcoming with each other. And going crashing through the woods is no way for the soul to be a part of our engagement with each other. The poet Billy Collins, he wrote a poem called Introduction to Poetry. I just have to read it to you because it describes our Bible studies. I think sometimes, not all. You probably have these very mature, deeply spiritual things, but for some of us, think about how Billy Collins talks about his teaching students poetry. He writes, I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. That's the way I sense sometimes our Bible studies is we get together not to allow the Bible to awaken something in us, awaken something in our community, but to sort of hammer at it, pick it apart until it yields what it really means, whatever that is. But could it be that the Bible is all about Christ inviting us into a conversation in which Christ is initiating the conversation and inviting us simply to ponder deeply in our hearts, to listen with the ear of our hearts? Well, for years and years, I looked for a way to do small groups in the Episcopal Church. In my first little church, it began meeting in a warehouse out in the country, and eventually it grew rapidly. We didn't have to, but we did build a church building. Some people wondered if that was a smart thing to do after we had done it, but it kept growing after that, and finally I realized I need to find a way to get these people into small groups so that they are tending to one another in soulful ways. And I went off to a big conference on small groups that was headed by these mega church pastors, and there were Episcopalians, but a guy named Bill Hybels, Willow Creek Church was there, and they were talking about something called cell groups, CELL groups. But their idea is not like a monastic cell, it's like a biological cell. Their theory was that a healthy body of a church is made up of healthy cells. So if you've got a bunch of small groups that are healthy, well, you've got a healthy church. That kind of made sense to me intuitively. But I realized at the conference that really many of them were employing this model as a means primarily of church growth, and that started to show. That is, if you go out if you have a little group of people who meet once a week to sort of catch up with each other and discern spiritual things, and then you go to your office and you find somebody who's going through a rough patch with a child and a marriage, with work, whatever, with depression, then you might say to that person, you know, I have a group that meets on Tuesday evenings. It's a church group, and we'd welcome you to join us if you like. And in this way, you know, inviting people into an intimate community, and inevitably these small groups would get bigger and bigger, and they would need to divide into 2 cells, and then 4, and so on. This is how megachurches often would grow, by way of these cell groups and constant divisions. Well, I don't know, that just, you know, I started trying that out, but it just didn't fit our ethos as Episcopalians somehow. And my wife, who grew up Southern Baptist, you know, she was aware of how adults in the Baptist church, anyway, they'd get into their Sunday school classes and they would stay in that same class their whole lives. You know, they wouldn't, they might sometimes miss church, That's rare for Southern Baptists, but they might sometimes miss, but they would never miss Sunday school, their Sunday school class. And I thought, ooh, that sounds like important. But I realized, no, Episcopalians aren't going to go for that. They don't want to get stuck, in a thing that's going to go on forever. So finally, years and years later, I found a model that seemed adaptable to my circumstances. And we ended up calling them Emmaus Groups. And I think this was the name ascribed to it by another Episcopal church out in California. But Emmaus, just the name itself conveys an important aspect of what they're all about. You remember the story of the road to Emmaus. Disciples of Jesus walking the way to Emmaus are all downcast, grieving because the one they had pinned their hopes on had been killed. And they're talking with each other about the things that matter most in their life to them. And they're joined by someone who appears to be a stranger. Now, and the stranger says, "What are you guys talking about?" And they said, "What? Are you the only one who hasn't heard, about these things that have happened?" And they said, "What things?" And he said, "Well, about Jesus of Nazareth." And they pour their hearts out about the crucifixion and how they had pinned their hopes, all their lives on this thing. And this stranger begins talking about the Bible with them in a way that sort of has their hearts burning, And they arrive at Emmaus, and the stranger, who is Christ, they just don't recognize him. The stranger is getting ready to walk on, and they said, "No, please stay with us. Evening is at hand. The days of let us break bread together." And so the stranger stays, and they break bread, and their eyes are opened to the real presence of Christ with them, has been with them all this time, and he vanishes. Well, this is the story of Emmaus. That's your story. It's my story. Every day you are encountering Christ. I'm encountering, and we don't know it. We're not mindful of it. We're not aware of this truth. We're carrying around Christ within ourselves, and we hardly know these things. So Emmaus groups are these, first of all, it involves a closed-ended commitment of 10 weeks. And the parish's program year from 1st of September to the end of May is divided into 3 10-week segments. We call them covenant periods. And we invite anybody who wants to join an Emmaus group can make that known. And they would covenant to do 4 things, which I will describe in a minute. But at the end of that 10-week period, if they hated it, or they just thought it was too awkward or too weird or something like that, then they could get out. Or they could re-up for the next 10 weeks and the next 10 weeks. And we always told our people, take the summer off. Nobody's around anyway. Episcopalians are always dispersed and all that. And you can come back in the fall. Well, it turns out almost nobody would get out of a group. Once they were in, they were hooked. This way of being with each other that I will now describe, this way of covenanting to be with each other. There are 4 pillars, 4 sort of principles or things that we're observing in an Emmaus group. The first is you're covenanting that you will engage in a time of spiritual reflection with this small group of 6 to 10 people. That is you're saying, I will step off the busy treadmill of my life to come to a place apart from it all with this small group of people. And I will ask myself the question, how is it with my soul? How is it with my soul? I might also ask, where is it this past week that I have experienced Christ in my life? Where has Christ been trying to get my attention? nudging me? Maybe. Just asking these questions has a way of attuning oneself to the reality that these questions are alluding to, that Christ is with us. Instead of just kind of, staying on the treadmill, getting home, turning on the TV, doing it just a little time once a week with a small group of people who are similarly asking the questions. A principle about the gatherings is no one has to say anything. You don't have to go around the circle and say, so how is it with your soul? And how is it with your soul? And with your, no. Sometimes we just need to be quiet and be still. And if we trust that this is a place, this is a small group where my soul can emerge and I can speak these things that are sort of bubbling up within me and not be judged, no matter what I say, that nobody in this group is going to do, oh, I know all about that. That's happened to me a lot of times. Let me tell you how I dealt with it. Then the soul just goes running back into the woods. No, we are learning to treat each other reverently, allowing these things to emerge, not with a bunch of me too-isms or a desire to fix each other, but with this belief that we have that Christ is with everyone, within everyone, and we can facilitate the emergence of that truth. So spiritual reflection. The second pillar is mutual care and support. We just promised that, as it was implicit in what I just said, we will support and care for each other in the spiritual journey. That manifests itself in all kinds of ways over time that are simply beautiful. Throughout the pandemic, the places that remained healthiest at St. Stephen's Church were these many small groups, these many Emmaus groups, where people continued to be present to each other, often just by Zoom, but they were always checking in with each other because they knew each other well. They knew about their marriages, their children, their work circumstances, whatever it was. So spiritual reflection, mutual care and support, prayer. The group meetings themselves might have a time of prayer, but you are covenanting that you will pray for each person by name every day, and they will all be doing the same for you. And there is nothing like that kind of realization that you are not alone day by day, but are supported by a fellowship of prayer. And then when you come back to your next group meeting, if the only thing that happens is this, that you walk into that room and the person says, welcome, Joshua. It's so good to see you. You told me that you told us last week that you had this meeting on Thursday that was going to be a difficult one for you and you weren't sure how you were going to handle it. And, we've been praying for you. How are you? How are you? To be known this way, to be known by name and with some intimate awareness of the difficulties, and we all have so many that we're carrying around secretly, and that those difficulties and those burdens are shared by others, just healing in itself, healing. And the fourth pillar after prayer is service, some act of service. That is, throughout the 10 weeks, we would gather each week to ponder how it is with our soul, where we're meeting Christ and so forth, supporting each other, praying for each other. But one week in that covenant period, we're going to go off and do something together of service to others on the premise that in serving others, we're meeting Christ. And we are bumping into Christ with each other as we do these things together. It's another way of coming into awareness of the presence. Okay, so I need to wrap this up quickly in case there's a question or two, but I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but Joshua has passed out to you a story called The Rabbi's Gift that the therapist Scott Peck used in his book, A Different Drum. And it's, I think, just a beautiful parable. Peck was writing about community at the time, and in this parable, it's the story of a monastery that had fallen on difficult times. It had gradually gone into decline. You might substitute parish church for the monastery. I mean, just sort of the gradual deterioration, the falling away of the church. And this rabbi, though, has this habit of showing up nearby in a hermitage in the woods, in a little hut where he prays. And the monks, the 5 remaining monks, would become aware of his presence and would whisper to each other, "The rabbi's in the woods." And the abbot, upon hearing that the rabbi was there, went out to be with him, and they commiserate about the demise, the gradual decline of the monastery. And the rabbi said, "Oh, I so feel for you. It's true everywhere. The spirit seems to have gone out of the people." And the abbot said, "Well, is there any advice you can give us?" And he says, "No, I'm afraid there's nothing I can say. The only thing I can tell you is the Messiah is one of you. The Messiah is one of you." And so the abbot, they embraced, and he left and went back to the monastery. And the other 4 brothers said, "Well, what did he say? Did he give any advice?" He said, "No, he couldn't say anything. But he did say something strange as I left. He said, 'The Messiah is one of us.'" And what precipitates after that is this, that each of the brothers starts to wonder, wait, if the Messiah is one of us, who would it be? Oh, it must be the abbot. He's such a holy person. Or maybe it was Brother Elred, or maybe it's so-and-so. It couldn't be me. But maybe, well, if on the off chance it is me. They started treating themselves and one another with this renewed kind of reverence and respect, kind of awe and wonder and kindness, gentleness, embrace. And people still came to the monastery grounds to picnic and all that, but they picked up on this beauty of community, the way that these monks treated each other. And over time, the whole thing everybody wanted to be closer to this, and more people started joining the monastery. So a new kind of flourishing happened. In other words, for me anyway, one of the lessons of the parable is it's not about some flashy new way of being a church, but maybe it's about something as simple as paying attention to Jesus's, one of the last things he said to his disciples. Judas has gone out to betray him, and Jesus says, "Okay, look, there's not much time now left. You've heard me teach a lot of things, a lot of parables, you know all the commandments, but I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just love each other. This is how all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for each other." And sure enough, just a few centuries later, a theologian named Tertullian said, outsiders, the reason the church is exploding in growth is that outsiders are looking at us and they're thinking, what? Look at how those Christians love each other. That's the life I want. I'm tired of this dog-eat-dog, violent world I live in, and I want it for myself and for my family. And that's why the church was growing. It's nothing flashy. It's not, special programs or anything. It's just learning how to be soulfully present and welcoming to each other. Okay, I think I've blown it though. I think I've gone too long. Joshua, is there anything you want to do?
Well, if you all will join me in thanking, we're right in time. Such a wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yes, and invitation to a Holy Week continues for some of these spiritual practices. Also, as we continue to think about how to revitalize our small groups, this is really an amazing push in that direction. Gary, thank you.
Hey, Joshua,
Yes,
can I close with a prayer when it's time?
please. Thank you.
Okay. I've just loved being with you all. Lots of love to you. And I'll close with this sort of prayer. It's attributed to Teresa Lisieux. May today there be a peace within. May you trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born of faith. May you use those gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. May you be content, knowing you are a child of God. Let this presence settle into your bones and allow your soul the freedom to sing, dance, praise, and love. It is there for every one of us. Amen. Thank you, Joshua.
Thanks, Jamal.